So Steve Isoardi has gone out of his way in the middle of a lot of busy work that he's up to find some time to be with us today. Steve, I've known for a long time. He started teaching at Antioch as an adjunct back in the early 90s, just a couple of years after I got to Antioch. And so we used to rattle around the halls and make whatever trouble we made back in the day. And he's also a writer, an oral historian, documentarian. You may recognize his name from his work on Central Avenue Sounds Project, which was both a book, and I believe it was Rhino Records that put out the box set on Central Avenue Sounds. I could be wrong about Rhino, but I'm pretty sure that's right. Which is a terrific collection of music from Central Avenue here in Los Angeles. And then another book, that was way back in '98, another book that he's put out that I want to mention because I think Steve is doing revisions on this. Maybe not, but The Dark Tree, Jazz and the Community Arts in Los Angeles. I think a second edition of that is coming out shortly. First edition came out back in 2005 or 6, somewhere in there. So we're really honored to have Steve here and to welcome him back to Antioch. How you doing, Steve?
Great, and thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to return to Antioch and be involved. A lot of great memories, a lot of great experiences.
Yeah, it was just terrific to see you. So I wanted to get us started by trying to sort of set a historical context for both the Central Avenue period of the music scene here in Los Angeles, and then also as a way of jumping into Tapscott's work with Papa and Agma and those organizations. But I don't know how many people have a good sense of the central role of Central Avenue in the history of Los Angeles's music scene and Black community. So would you mind setting us up a little bit with, how that came to be in the pre-war period in particular, and the role that it played in the community?
Yeah, certainly. Central Avenue before 1950 really became LA's Harlem. It was the center of a very segregated Black community. Segregation against African Americans really starts coming in after the turn of the century, and especially in the late teens, when if you were African American, by then you pretty much had to live along Central Avenue or in another little area, sort of LA's Sugar Hill, that was west of that, on Adams, near Adams and Normandy. But it became the center of a vibrant community then. It satisfied most people's social needs, business needs, economic needs, cultural needs. The avenue was block after block of clubs, of various businesses, some white-owned, but some Black-owned. And it became, despite the depredations of segregation, and it was in LA pretty vicious. I mean, I think you have to think of LA then as a southern town with much more in common with, like Mississippi, Alabama, Texas than a lot of the northern cities. It was, the segregation was vicious. It got even worse in the 40s, 50s, but that was hard. But in spite of that, this community in many ways did flourish, certainly culturally, artistically, and especially musically, because the number of people of fine artists who emerged from the Central Avenue community between World War I and about 1950 is staggering. And until fairly recently, most people hadn't a clue about it. When I first heard of Central Avenue, I was shocked. I mean, I remember reading a biography by Ross Russell of Charlie Parker. And at one point, he's talking about Bird and Dizzy Gillespie's trip to play in LA at the end of 1945, and how after they played at Billy Berg's in Hollywood, they would go down to Central Avenue to jam. And I was surprised at what the hell was on Central Avenue. And I remember driving down there, and this was in the 80s. And I drove down there, and Central Avenue then was mostly block after block of rubble-filled lots, chain link fences, old buildings in disrepair. And I was surprised what you had to wonder whatever could have occurred down here of any consequence. And I remember going back to my saxophone teacher then, a great artist named Bill Green, and saying, you ever think about Central Avenue? And he just laughed and he said, yeah, I came out here in the 40s from Kansas City. I was in the middle of all that. And I started hearing stories about it. And I was just stunned that although I thought I knew something of jazz history, there was nothing about Central Avenue. And the more I learned and the more I got into it, I came to appreciate the richness of it, which was really staggering, kind of generation after generation. The number of people here, the number of artists, make it even, this makes the point perhaps better than most. One of the great early jazz musicians from New Orleans, Kid Ory, came out here in 1919. He brought a lot of his great musicians with him. And in 1922, they went into a recording studio and recorded 2 instrumentals, which became the first recordings of a Black New Orleans jazz band. And those were made in Santa Monica. But nobody knew this history. So the history of the contributions is really rich, but you had to start digging for it. And that's what got me involved in it and doing oral history, because there was very little documentation at all. I remember interviewing Lois Shelton, who had done a documentary film called Ernie Andrews' Blues for Central Avenue. Came out in '86. That also kind of hit me to what was there. And when I was talking to Lois about it, she said, she was a student at LACC then, and this it began as a class project, but became really a wonderful documentary, bigger than a class project. She said when she started doing it, she thought she'd go down to the LA Public Library, get the files on Central Avenue, and make this film. Well, she said there was nothing on Central Avenue. In the photography collection down there, you would think that LA was a town similar to Scandinavian towns in Minnesota or Wisconsin. There was nothing on the diversity of LA in the record at all. That started changing when Carolyn Kozo Cole became the head of the photography collection, and she and her team went out to various communities over a number of years and documented 22 different communities in LA and their history, including Central Avenue. But there was nothing. So I thought, with the encouragement of my teacher to do it, the best way was through oral history. Because what we did have were still quite a few people left with good memories. And so a great way to get at this history was by recording their lives and their memories. And that's what evolved from that. But what came out was a history that was so rich in many dimensions. I focused on the music, but there are others waiting to be done, like dance, literature, et cetera. And there hasn't been that much done, but I'm hopeful in the future there will. This was a very vibrant, rich community over a considerable period of time. It's like a quote from McCoy Tyner: "Pressure creates diamonds." And I think that's certainly what happened along Central Avenue. Not that, it was all glorious. There were a lot of struggles. There were hard times. There were struggles for civil rights on the avenue. There were struggles that musicians faced traveling outside the Central Avenue area. They used to refer to Glendale as Little Mississippi because anytime you got invited to play in a club and you went there, as soon as you entered the city limits of Glendale, they'd be surrounded by cop cars who would accompany them to the club. And when they finished playing, would escort them back out of the city limits. So it was a very hard time. During those years, the Klan was active. Like I said, in a lot of ways, LA was a Southern town then. In the mid-20s, the chief of police was a member of the KKK. So it was difficult, it was very hard, but the vibrancy of the community and the fact that by necessity, everyone was forced together. There was a lot of interchange, a lot of interaction, and a lot of artistic growth and musical growth.
So Steve, thank you for that. And then, you know, when I think of that part of Los Angeles and the Black community in Los Angeles in the early 20th century, I think of a relatively conservative community. And I might be wrong about that, but I wonder then, you know, what was the relationship between the community and these jazz clubs, which were anything but conservative? Yeah.
Well, you have to remember that because of segregation, everyone was there. It was all classes and people with all different views. So it was very much a mixed bag. There were certainly people in the community who were very conservative, who were opposed to anything like this. That certainly was there. But I remember one time there was a panel at the MoCA facility down at First and Central in the mid-90s. And on the panel was Betty Cox, who had a career teaching music in the community, and she put together a book on the Black music history of LA, which she self-published. And she was on this panel, along with, among others, trumpetiste Clara Bryant, you know, who really developed as an artist on Central when she came out here at the age of 18. And Betty, at one point, this is a panel on Central Avenue with musicians on the panel. And Betty says, well, because she grew up in the community. And she said, well, you know, I was a good girl, so I never went to the clubs on Central Avenue. Well, Clara almost took her head off. And she just exploded saying, because I played in clubs on Central Avenue, I was a bad girl. Is that what you're saying? Oh my God. So yeah, there were those differences, no question. But even amongst those who decried, you know, jazz and the music as the devil's music, etc., I think there was still a perception that it was part of the community. May not like it, but it wasn't something being imported from outside or anywhere else. It was part of the community and of the history. So yeah, there was that, no question. It was complex. It was complex in terms of class, in terms of politics, etc.
You mentioned a couple of musicians in that part of your story who happen to be women. And, you know, I admit I don't know a lot other than what I've read from your work, basically, about the Central Avenue scene. But it seems like, you know, I get introduced to men. And so it's interesting to hear you mention these women that were also part of the scene. And were they anomalies, or was there a good fit with them in that scene, or how were they?
Well, yeah, I mean, there were probably more women performing there than in most other ethnic communities. But, you know, the machismo was pervasive, patriarchy was pervasive, but along Central Avenue, especially among those people interested in the nightlife and the culture and the music, it struck me that it was a bit more wide open and more accepting. In the 1940s, gee, I could count easily on two hands the number of really important women artists who came out of the community. The three that stand out in my mind were Clara Bryant, well, actually they stand out because they played horns. I mean, during that era, when you did see women performers, especially on the national stage, it was either as vocalists or pianists, maybe, with big bands. And that was about it, aside from the number of all-woman bands that did exist in some areas and actually had more visibility during World War II, because so many men were gone. But along Central Avenue, in the 40s, for instance, you had Clara Bryant emerging as a young trumpeter. You had Melba Liston. At the age of 16, she is playing first trombone and arranging music in Gerald Wilson's big band, which in 1946 was one of the most popular bands in the country. And then you also had Vi Red, who of course sang the blues beautifully, but also played hellish alto saxophone. So you did have a number of people like this emerging, really cutting their teeth on the avenue. And I think that was important. There were a number of others as well. I think it would really be interesting to delve into that more and get more of the background stories on many of the other women. What's interesting too, I remember, I think it was around 44 when the International Sweethearts of Rhythm came to play Central Avenue. And this was probably the most prominent all-woman band in the country. And they kind of took Central Avenue by storm. The reviews in the California Eagle told their readers, go hear the Sweethearts. They're as good as the Basie Band. And they were good. So there was that. There was also another thing that happened on Central Avenue, which speaks to even larger issues of the gay community and others. There was for over 17, maybe almost 20 years, once a year at the Club Alabama, which was kind of the leading club theater on Central Avenue, they had a drag queen contest that was very popular. And there's some photos from some of the competitions. And I know one person, you mentioned Horace Tapscott. Well, his wife, Celia, told me that when she was much younger then, she and her mother would always go down to the Club Alabama when they had the drag queen contest because they loved, you know, the way that people dressed and acted, et cetera. It was really fun. And there were a lot of people there all participating. So, you know, it was the kind of thing that anywhere else in LA, you probably would have had the police department breaking it up and God knows who else going after the participants. So not that it was completely beyond the prejudices and the stereotypes. I mean, that was also part of the Black community like every other community. But it seemed like on Central, there was among the artists, among the club goers, a bit more openness and acceptance.
Thank you for that perspective. That's something I'd love to talk to you more about, but I want to move us along to an arbitrary division of the post-war period. And we've mentioned Tapscott and his involvement in that period in the formation, what was it, 61 of the People's Pan-African Orchestra. Could you introduce to our audience a little bit of who Tapscott was and the significance of the People's Pan-African Orchestra?
Yeah, well, happy to. Horace, he is one of my heroes. And it is the end of 1961 that he and a half dozen fellow musicians start forming the Underground Musicians Association. It'll go through a few incarnations. By 1971, it will be known as the Pan-African People's Orchestra. And their purpose was they felt that in the immediate post-war period, with the end of Central Avenue, that a lot of the community spirit and cement holding people together was disappearing. And they thought that the arts could make a difference by making the arts more a part of the everyday life of their community. They could improve the life of their community. And that's the task they set off on. Now, they were veterans of Central Avenue. Horace came out here from Houston, Texas, when he was 9 years old in 1943, moved with his mother and sister just off Central Avenue. So he grew up experiencing, as a very young man, the last best days of Central Avenue. And to him, the community feel of the avenue was so important. It was so important in shaping him, as were many formative influences also in Houston. And he really appreciated that. He thought this really was essential for the strength, the growth of any community. And he thought the arts should play a role. I think he and many of the members also, from what they drew from their knowledge of African-American history, and especially West African history and traditional culture, they felt the arts had a role to play and was positive and was an essential part of the health of any community. And for Horace, he grew up on Central. He was on the streets all the time. On Central Avenue, because of segregation, there was a separate musicians union, a Black musicians union on Central Avenue, 1710 South Central. And that's the union you had to join. The white union in Hollywood was closed. But what that meant was, and because visiting African-American musicians had no other place to go than the community around Central Avenue, they were all around. So Horace was always hanging out at the musicians union. He would meet Louis Armstrong. He was able to sit in as a kid on rehearsals of the Duke Ellington Band. When Gerald Wilson was rehearsing his new band there, Horace was walking by one day with his trombone case, and Gerald said, "Hey, young blood, can you play that thing?" And Horace, being 13, said, "Yeah." So what does he do? He takes him upstairs where his band is, and he sits him down next to Melba Liston in the trombone section. And Horace said he didn't know where they were after the first bar or two, but they encouraged him, and Melba gave him the music to go home and work on it. And when he was still in high school, he was sitting in with Gerald's band and played a few gigs with them. So there was this kind of exposure, all these great artists who really prized the idea of passing it on, taking the young people and bringing them into the culture and mentoring them. And all of this had a huge impact on Horace and his friends. And he talks about many of the other artists his age who were just hanging out at the musicians union, like Eric Dolphy, Frank Morgan, if you know jazz. You know, these are Lawrence Marable. These are all great artists. And they would just be there, you know, getting what they could from their elders and being encouraged. And at various clubs, as they got older in high school, they would be invited. They went by clubs. They'd be invited to sit in with bands. It was kind of an open feeling and a lot of sharing and jamming. So this Horace really felt, it's the way he grew up. It's what he felt was important in the community. And then he also studied at Jefferson High School with a legendary teacher named Samuel Brown, who very much, he not only embraced jazz, even though he was classically trained, he embraced jazz and even started offering jazz classes and a big band class. Music students at Jeff could take this big band class from Sam Brown, and he encouraged them to arrange, to write music. They could hear what they were doing. He would bring all of these great artists who were passing through town or lived in the community. He'd bring them into the school, and then he'd go out to the clubs because there were so many opportunities with the kids. So he had a tremendous influence. And one of the things he told them, and he did tell Horace, was, "I'll give you the magic if you promise to pass it on." So all of this had a huge impact on Horace. And by the time of 1961, he was a young man, 26 years old. He'd been on the up escalator in the jazz world, playing trombone, arranging and rehearsal piano with Lionel Hampton's big band, you know, one of the most important bands internationally. And he tells a story how early 61, they were early one morning, they were getting on the bus, head off again, you know, to play around the country. And he walked off the bus. He turned to a friend and he said, "That's it, brother, I've had it." And he walked home with this new purpose forming in his mind of putting together a community ensemble. Similarly inclined musicians drawn from the community to create their own music. They were repelled by the commercial world and the commercial demands, and also to make their music, which they saw as the community's music, a force within the community. And that's what they took off on and started building. And in no time, so many musicians joined them. One of the most important being a year later, the great alto saxophonist Arthur Blythe, but also many others who had great careers. And in no time, they were playing throughout the community. And it's not that they were getting gigs, because they had a large ensemble, but it varied. It could be anywhere from a half dozen to 24. It was very loose. And they would play wherever they could. I remember one of the early members told me, their attitude was, "You won't give us work? Fine, we'll make our own work." So they would play in parks. They would go to schools. One point, somebody even gave them a flatbed truck. So they put the band on a flatbed truck and they would go to a busy intersection, like on a Saturday, and play for a while. Then they take off, go to another intersection and play. South Park was a favorite gathering place for them. And they would just head down to South Park, get up on the bandstand and just start blowing. And this is, what they did year after year after year. Every once in a while, there might be a pay gig somewhere, but those were pretty rare. So what is extraordinary to me is that he was able to do this. And his fellow artists, well, Horace passed in '99, for almost 40 years. How do you keep during that time, by my estimate, about 300 different artists passed through this organization. How do you keep something like this together when there's no money? It's never a question of money. It's not involved at all. So it, to me, was and remains a tremendous achievement. I think one of the great stories, not just of Los Angeles's Black community or nationally, but one of the great American stories. I've always felt this. And when I got into this and learned more and more, I was always stunned that why isn't anybody else down here getting this history? But so that's, briefly what kind of Horace was about and what he was doing. I will say also, he's probably the only person I've met in my life who I would say had charisma. I've never seen anything like it. The way he could attract people and influence people was just extraordinary to see. I know there are many directions to go in talking about this. So
yes, well, and I'm thinking about that. One, I'm so glad you mentioned Sam Brown and his influence, which I think sometimes gets overlooked. And to know that a high school teacher could make such a difference and have such a commitment to the community and to music and the arts. I was thinking about your book, The Dark Tree, and I was poking around in it a little bit a few days ago. I've got this quotation from you as you're describing the arc of the book. You say it's a story of the struggle by many artists to rediscover and rebuild community, to forge an ethic of community involvement, and to create an aesthetic derived from and as part of that involvement. In which it just really resonated with me, especially to create an aesthetic derived from and as part of that involvement. And where is this leading me? Well, I guess I'm so appreciative of Tapscott's work, but it remains a mystery to me at some level. You know, where did the motivation, you know, that the story that you tell of him just getting off the bus and saying, you know, I've had it. I'm not going to go on tour. The racial divide and so it's just too much, and I'm out of here, and I'm going to plop down in my community, and I'm going to do something. And then he comes up with what becomes the Ark. You know, where does that come from? What's the motivation? What you know, I'm not even sure of the question, but something along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to indicate that a bit earlier in talking about how he grew up. I mean, and the way we started his autobiography, Songs of the Unsung, wasn't just talking about Horace, but the community he grew up in. And that's what he always felt, that he was shaped by his community. And he felt there was the things he noticed about his community that influenced him the most were those commonalities, those shared experiences. He liked the way when he was a little kid in Houston, for instance, in LA, he was never a member of a church, because whereas in Houston, he and his family were, because the church there, they saw doing whatever was necessary to help that particular community. There were social things, economic things. It wasn't just going on Sunday for a service. There were things going on almost every day of the week. People were helping each other. If somebody needed some work done on their house, they got that together at a church meeting. Somebody who had the skills to take care of this would do that. This is what he saw, people helping each other. And that's what affected him the most. When he was 6 years old, he put his first band together, he and some of his friends. And they had no instruments. They had pots, pans, things like this, but they would get together and play anyway. And the families would come out and listen to them and support them. And so I think there was a sense of togetherness and self-help, mutuality that just he drew from for his entire life. And he saw the art, music as coming out of this and as part of this. And him getting off the bus was just basically at the beginning of his career, making his return home. And for the rest of his life, he sought to deepen this in his homeland. So it wasn't a return home at the end of this long process, a lifetime process. It was at the very beginning. And then he just sought to deepen this. And this was the attitude. I mean, it was profoundly, in some ways, reminiscent of a lot of traditional West African cultures, but it was also perhaps using that to look beyond kind of the atomization, the isolation that capitalism produces, the commerciality, and to him, the destruction of what this means between individuals and within communities and between communities. So the way they acted was in every way opposed to that, even if they weren't formulating political manifestos. So they had a band where money never really played much of a role. There was no competition within his organization. You know, in jazz, they're all legends of cutting contests and things like this. No place within his organization. The idea was to help whoever is around and participating. You help them. You don't cut anybody down. You don't say whose solo is better than someone else's solos. If someone's having difficulty reading something or whatever, you help them. It's the way you pass it on. And when the band would appear, you could have 2 or 3 generations on stage of varying abilities and levels. But they learned through continual play together and immersion, which again is a very traditional way of going about it. It was also important for him. He also felt that in this way, you can encourage creativity more within artists. And the way they would do that, when they would have classes sometimes with especially kids who had no musical background, they would begin without anything related to music. No instruments, no staff on a chalkboard, no music books, nothing like that. they would have these kids come together in a room, and Horace would have them express something musically using whatever they could find around them. If it was an eraser, a book on the floor, a desk, a chair, or just tapping on the floor, the wall, whatever. Go ahead and create something musically. And he would have them doing this over and over again, session after session, and then working with each other to kind of combine their musical impulses. He said only when they felt completely comfortable doing that would they introduce what he called the censorship. And that's music theory and instruments and particular ways to play instruments, etc. They believe that you start with creativity, expressing who you are in your environment. And when you do that, and I think that kind of insight comes from an appreciation of community and what's around you. And he also encouraged people always. Part of his musical inspiration came from just being in his community, which he thought was crucial, and also drawing from it, from its political issues, economic, social issues, from its everyday life. So some of his, people have talked about some of his compositions as being really complex and hard, especially rhythmically. I mean, some of his pieces, you'll have half a dozen meter changes, within one chorus, which to sit down and read something like that is crazy. It's a lot of work. And people would ask, where do you get this stuff? He says, it's just what I see in my community. He would pay attention to the cadences, the rhythms that were around him. He'd see a group of kids walking down the street, and he'd pay attention to the way they were walking. And he out of that, in some cases, a composition could emerge. So he always felt that you have to be in your community and you have to express what you're seeing, what you're feeling, what is going on around you. And that is the best way to be creative and contributive as an artist. It's the best way then to make a contribution to your community, to experience what's happening and try and feed that back artistically. There are times when he would, in performances, he would introduce a piece, not by giving the name of a composition, but he would turn to the audience and then he'd say, this is just another one you wrote through us. And so there is this kind of ongoing dialectic. He once said too that, I could write about red roses on a bush because we have those here in our community. But what interests me more is the dirt it's growing in. And so I think there is this profound sense going back to his very early years in Houston of what community is, how people should relate to each other, how a community should act to the betterment, of everyone. And he saw examples of that, which were the most important things he took from his childhood in Houston. And to him, Central Avenue was a dramatic demonstration of that, which isn't to say, of course, and as we said earlier, the African-American community was as complex as any other. It was class divided, et cetera, politically divided, you name it, religiously divided. But what he saw and experienced, which was so prominent, at least in his musical world, were all of these positive, collective, communal things that he just elevated into a defining worldview. And one of the things he always preached within his organization was that the community is family. Family is community. And most of the people I interviewed over 100 people in that movement. And a lot of them talk about how with being around Horace and all the others, they came to really appreciate and see each other as family. And a lot of them would say that the ones who went away but would come back and play with a band at an event or something, they would say how profound it was for them. It was like returning to your family. So it's, it's something like that is hard to get at in anyone, But I think these are some of the elements that factored in with Horace. And he was one of the ways too he would experience his community. There are times when he would go days without sleep. And what he would do, and it could be any time of the day or night, he would just drive around the community. He just enjoyed being there in the most ordinary circumstances you can imagine. And sometimes he would get a couple of friends and they would just drive from musician's house to musician's house, friend's house to friend's house, and they'd pull up at a house and Horace would signal they were there by tapping out one of his tunes on his horn. Whoever was inside would come out and join him.
So I love the way that you language so much of this and this sense of how Horace, gave expression, gave voice to his community. And you quoted him. It's one of my favorites, where he says, this is one more that you wrote through us.
Isn't that great?
It's such a great line, and I wanted to hit it again because it went by so fast. I don't know if everybody hears it, but that sense that I'm a mouthpiece. I'm a vehicle for what's going on in my community, and you guys are writing the music, and I'm just letting it come through me. And that takes me to, I think, what'll have to be our last question, and we'll open it up to see if there's questions from the audience. But, it is the connection between music, community, activism, and spirituality. It seems to me that there's an underlying spirituality that runs through his work. If you wanted to say a word or two about that before we open it up.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question about that. It's one of the huge appeals of it. Although I must say, I have one little bit of a grievance with, I guess, the overuse of that word today. It's like there's always an attempt to label something. And for about the last 4 or 5 years, a lot of people, I guess, around the music and the industry, whatever, have kind of put this label on the new jazz as spiritual jazz. And of course, Horace being one of the godfathers of it and his movement. And this is all, when people talk about their movement, they just say, well, he was an example of spiritual jazz, but that's usually defined in such a narrow way. It's important to realize that the spirituality also meant an activist stance. It was also political and social. Spirituality, the highest form of spirituality, is, one could say, is a commitment to the rest of humanity and to improving humanity. And hence their strong political stances over the years and involvements. They weren't a political organization per se. They never generated manifestos. They didn't vote on adopting particular political lines, but they were very active from day one in political issues that were of importance to the community and even internationally. I remember when I was interviewing Jane Cortez, the late poet, and who was performing out here with Horace in the early mid 60s when she was getting a chapter of SNCC going here in LA. And she said Horace was far and away the most political musician of anyone else that she knew around. So that was always a part of it, their activist position, their political consciousness, their political awareness as part of, a spiritual view of improving humanity. And I think it's important to keep that in mind in talking about that. The other thing I wanted to mention was another slogan of theirs that appeared on the orchestra's early albums. Our music is contributive, not competitive. And it's another example of how they saw themselves in their music. And I mean, that sense of going against so much of what there is and building up the community. If you look at those same early orchestra albums, there is only one piece of Horace's on those albums. And there are two contributions that are sort of classics. But the rest of the music is about 13 compositions are from 8 different members of his organization. Now, how many jazz leaders do something like that? None. He could have, if he had wanted to, created a band that existed to perform his music. And he could have devoted himself to doing that and been very successful as a composer, band leader, etc. But he knew, and he often said that, no, what would I want to do that for? He said, I'm trying to make a contribution to the community. And he knew that the only way this could happen is if there were more musicians and artists involved and contributing, that it couldn't be just one person. So he went out of his way to encourage everybody around him to write, to perform, and to contribute. And that to me was another kind of extraordinary thing. He literally saw himself as part of a collective and did whatever he could to make the collective succeed. You know, not just Horace Tapscott, the great band leader.
Well, in your writing, you talk about him being invisible. Yeah, that's where he didn't need to have the spotlight on him. He was fine being invisible.
Yeah. I mean, obviously he would have wished for more success, et cetera. And unfortunately, when that kind of success came to him, he only had a few years left. But it wasn't, in fact, and the whole organization, it was part of the times in the 60s and 70s. But when they started, they turned their back, literally, on the commercial world completely, on the quote unquote outside world. And they didn't want anything to do with it. Horace didn't have much interest in recording then for commercial labels. They were interested in maybe trying to do some recording that they controlled their own work, but they really looked at the other way. And the other thing too to remember, if we're talking about the 60s and 70s, what made that possible was they were just busy all the time because there was so much happening in South Central Los Angeles during that era. You're talking about a community that covered 48 square miles of LA. And during the 60s and 70s, especially after 65, there was so much artistic, musical activity going on, so many spaces and organizations that they were busy all the time performing throughout their community. I mean, we're talking, literally dozens of art spaces and organizations, thousands of people involved in the arts in various ways, while working full time and yet participating in artwork at the Mafundi Institute or the Watts Writers Workshop or whatever at night. I mean, all of this stuff was percolating and happening at that time. So it was, in a sense, easier for them to kind of ignore the outside world, if you will, because there was so much vibrancy and so much going on. And to this day, I don't understand why there haven't been dozens of dissertations, books, etc., writing about some of these spaces and what was happening in the community in the 60s and the 70s. I think things like this were going on in most other cities in the country and communities. But from what little I've researched, it has to have been in LA one of the broadest and deepest, if not the most, within the country.
Let's see if there's some questions from the audience. I know, Asa, you've been monitoring the chat. Is there anything?
There's nothing yet. I can get us started. I have a couple of questions. Well, one, I was wondering, I know the orchestra still plays, obviously not with Horace Tapscott since he died, but I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about his legacy and the legacy of that group continuing on today and what is kind of going on like right now in LA jazz as it relates.
I've just written about that. It's an epilogue to the second edition of The Dark Tree. Yeah, it was when Horace passed for about 15 years or so, it was rough. You know, there wasn't, Leimert Park was becoming gentrified. It was hard keeping things together. The kind of energy, you know, that they so drew on during those key years of the 60s and 70s that dissipated. But what I have seen recently is kind of a resurgence of interest. I think over the last half dozen years or so, there really has been a change. And part of it, I think, is attributable to the young people in there who are coming up now in their 20s. I've never seen before such interest in Horace and the Ark and the music as is happening now. There are 3 labels that are putting out some of this music from the archives, as well as new music, you know, which really hadn't happened before. These are small labels. But I also think it's part of a larger change. And I think 2015 was the annus mirabilis, if you will, in the community. 3 things happened. I think it's in May that Kamasi Washington's The Epic drops, his 3 CD set. And that just explodes internationally. And of course, Kamasi played in the orchestra, as well as Gerald Wilson's big band. He was a product of the community. His father's a saxophonist. And all of a sudden, and Kamasi is very rooted. I mean, a lot of us have been watching Kamasi since he was a teenager, playing in Leimert Park and other places. But beginning in 2015, the whole world knew about Kamasi Washington and his West Coast Get Down. And he, of course, talked a great deal about the community and about Leimert Park. So that, I think, had a big impact. The second thing was To Pimp a Butterfly. When that comes out, that's also very big. And people internationally know about the community in Leimert Park, many more than had ever before. And then finally, in 2015, at the Venice Biennale, the most important place for visual arts in the world. You know, every 2 years in Venice, the Venice Biennale hosts the most massive art show, which is a combination of pavilions that individual countries have, as well as other exhibition spaces with, I guess you could say, private or whatever exhibitions, but it's massive. Well, in 2015, the entire American pavilion was given to Mark Bradford. Mark Bradford spent a lot of time as a kid in Leimert Park. His mother had a hair salon there. And as a kid, he would sweep hair in there and he'd collect all the hair and then create things with it. Well, Mark Bradford is the hottest visual artist in the world now. I mean, his work goes for 7-8 figures, just staggering. And the whole pavilion was given over to him in the American Pavilion in 2015. There's a wonderful book of his exhibitions from that show there. So all of a sudden, Leimert Park really is just, it just kind of explodes. And it's growing. In 2019, the orchestra is selected as the main performance band at the New Year's celebration downtown in Grand Park. Now, that kind of exposure for the art in LA had never happened before. Then in, I think it was October 2020, a wonderful documentary film came out, 1 hour long, for KCET. And it was part of their Artbound series. And it's called The New West Coast Sound. You can go on the KCET website and see this. It's about 58 minutes long. And it's The New West Coast Sound. It's basically a documentary about Michaela Session, the young 20-something drummer whose dad, Michael Session, became the leader of the orchestra after Horace passed. Michaela grew up in the Ark, and he's leading the orchestra now. And they did this documentary on Michaela and the band now, but also with a long look back into the past and the history of the orchestra. They won an LA area Emmy for that documentary, which was really well done. Highly recommend people watch that if you want to see what's going on within the art now. So, I mean, all of this energy is happening. As we get reviews, one of the labels putting things out is Dark Tree Records, based in Paris, small label run by Bertrand Gasteau. He's very savvy about getting the word out to internationally. The reviews that have been coming in from European countries and elsewhere are just staggering about Horace and the Art. One Norwegian writer said, "I'll do whatever I can to help get this band over here." So there really is a growing interest. And I'm in another direction. My partner, Jeanette Lindsay, did a documentary film on Leimert Park. She was an Antioch student. This film began in an Antioch class. And she put together this hour-and-a-half documentary on Leimert Park. Came out on DVD in 2008, so it's a little bit dated. But that film is still playing around. It's being shown in villages elsewhere. We sent a copy to a village in Assam, India. They wanted to show it to their locals so they could see what you can do in a community with art. I mean, it's getting out there, it's growing. And I think there is a hunger for this story and for what one can accomplish. So the contemporary scene is the most positive it's been, certainly since Horace passed, at least from my standpoint. And this is the new Dark Tree release, Horace Tapscott Quintet, live at Catalina's Bar and Grill, 1995. It's a great CD.
You get royalties on that, Steve?
Oh God, no! Are you kidding? I hardly get any royalties for my books. Elaine, you know, right? The publishing, academic publishing, forget it.
So I want to honor our time. Our practice with Messy Conversations is to formally end at 5 o'clock. We didn't get a lot of room for audience questions. Part of our practice is also to continue on for another 15, 20 minutes informally, if there's interest. I've talked with Steve. I think you're willing to hang out for a little bit longer.
As long as you want. This is my favorite topic.
And so those of you that have to leave, remember next week will be our final Messy Conversation for the summer with Jacqueline Rose. And sorry, I'm blanking on the guest's name, but we'll be talking about diversity, inclusion, and equity.
Dr. Sam Dinger.
Thank you, Elaine. Appreciate it. For those of you that can hang out, let's hang out a little bit longer. And have some informal conversation with Steve. And as a way of getting us started, Steve, I'm just, I'm buoyed by what you're saying about you're seeing more interest and more energy. And I'm interested in your thoughts. I know you've got a background in political philosophy and politics and the labor movement and so on, as well as the arts. And from your sense, what is the role of the arts in political change and political struggle? And how are we doing currently?
Well, currently no one's doing anything. It seems it's pretty grim. It's pretty grim now, but all things change. I hope I'm still around when the wheel turns again. But the arts are very important. I mean, I've never felt that the arts in themselves can bring about revolution. I mean, I spent a lot of years in the left and in political work. And I felt that the only people who had the right to call themselves revolutionaries were members of revolutionary organizations. But you can be a supporter, a sympathizer, an activist in support, of political solutions. And I think that's what, I guess, one of the reasons Horace and I really connected when we sat down for long conversations, was talking about this. And I sort of really appreciated the fact that he supported, he was very politically conscious, as were many of the other members, very politically aware, and wanted to be very active. Their attitude was that they would support, they would discuss this throughout this period a lot. They would support anything they felt was helping advance the community, was good for the community, regardless. So that doesn't make them revolutionaries per se, but what it did mean was that they would be active in support the people who were out there putting it on the line. And they would do what they could as artists to support that. And I really kind of appreciated that. I thought I liked it because it was clear, politically very clear that. And I never had much use, especially when I was active politically, for people who claimed they were revolutionaries, but especially when I'd see professors get up in a classroom and say they were revolutionary, because they read some Marx and talked some Marx. I really I couldn't abide that. If they ever got near a picket line, they probably would have fainted dead away. But at the same time, you can be a very active supporter. And that's what they were. I mean, on the same day once, they performed for the Panthers. And then they went across town and performed for a Black Democratic candidate. And so their reach was pretty wide. And they said, these are capitalist candidates, but we have to have our chance. So we'll help them. We'll give them a chance. If they screw up, we won't support them again. But they have the right to screw up. But I could go on and on and on. If somebody has a question, I don't want to just sort of spend all my time on one question.
Yeah, that's what I'm looking for, to see in the chat if there are any questions, or from Asa. Anyone else get into the conversation?
Can I ask a question?
Please do, Jacqueline.
Since it's been a while. When it comes to the Central Avenue, I know that there was a councilwoman that had done a lot to preserve the Dunbar before it was going to disappear.
Jan Perry.
I was just wondering if there were other campaigns going to save these areas like Leimert Park and Central Avenue, because I know Leimert Park is currently under attack from gentrification, and the business owners are having a great deal of difficulty maintaining that area. And, when I go to Central Avenue, I go to particular buildings. So I was just wondering if there's anything that's happening right now to help it.
I mean, there are some things that you can point to. I mean, the Dunbar, of course, is a historical landmark now, so it's pretty safe, but we've lost so much. And some things happen. I mean, since '96, there's been the Central Avenue Jazz Festival, the last weekend of July, every summer, down on Central. I mean, the city closes off a number of blocks. And I think almost from MLK to Slauson, there's bandstands and there's a lot of music over 2 days. Things like that happen. There's been some cosmetic work on the avenue, but in terms of major attempts to kind of reclaim and take ownership of what remains in terms of structures, there really hasn't been much. I worked for a couple of years with a young couple who bought this little one-story, very old building constructed in 1904 at 3219 South Central. And when they found out about the history of this place, which used to be a legendary club called Jack's Basket Room, they were so excited, they decided they were going to try and recreate as much as they could the original Jack's inside. And, we came up with photos, a few photos of the interior, things like this, and everything was moving along. She was a graphic artist, he was a contractor. So they were doing all the work, redoing the place, getting city permits, et cetera, et cetera. And we're very excited. By, I think it was 2000, 17 or 18, they were a few months away from opening. They were just building in. We're going to make it part of the Central Avenue Jazz Festival. For a lot of us, it was really a thrill. And we had Linnell George with us kind of documenting as we went along. She was going to write it up. And we had a lot of musicians who thought this was fabulous, will help. And then I get a call from Jamie, the contractor who's doing all the work, one morning, and the place burned to the ground. Somebody torched it. And we don't know what happened, but after years of work and all this anticipation, it went away like that. And so it has been such a struggle over the years. There are a couple of other structures down there now that I'd love to see in better shape, but I don't see the city buying these properties and trying to restore or take care of them, and there aren't many left. And Leimert Park, I remember when the gentrification thing really, the rent increases, which started around 2002, hit and was driving a lot of people out. There was a rally at one point in the park, at Leimert Park. And I remember Marla Gibbs got up and said, look, you know, you can have all these rallies and you can talk about pressuring landlords, saving the spaces, but if we don't get together and buy these properties, there is nothing that's going to be able to save them. And sadly, I think it's turning out that way. It's really unfortunate. We're losing Esalen now. It's closing the end of the year. So it's grim in a lot of ways. I mean, there's a lot of excitement about it now. The irony is it's known internationally and there's a lot of excitement, but on the other hand, the future, it's always been, I guess, kind of dicey. And this happens not only here. How many times have artists moved into an area that they could afford, fixed it up, gotten things going, and then they lose it. They're forced out. Just happens over and over again. It's terrible. I don't see the current class leadership in this country doing much about it.
Makes me wonder, Steve. So there's this international interest in Leimert Park and the Arc and all of this. And if that's, does that have any political legs, or is it kind of a nostalgia for something that's slipping away?
No, I think it's nostalgia's come out of it, but it's excitement about the music. It's young people not only discovering new sounds, but then also going back and listening to the older stuff and getting very turned on about that. The music from the 60s and the 70s. They want to hear all these Horace Tapscott recordings from back in the day, the orchestra recordings. I mean, they're having kind of a renaissance now. So I think it's the excitement that a lot of the younger people are experiencing, discovering this music.
Other questions? Things you want to contribute?
I just wanted to say that I think that one of the greater influences for Horace and others with the music, there was the grassroots activism, which you addressed. And that somehow connects to even today, the young people having interest in the music, but it's also some political aspects. It's also activism, grassroots. Yeah. That combination that probably has the most influence. And I was just wondering, did you agree?
No, I definitely do. There's no question, because I mean, a lot of the artists I've talked to, musicians, I mean, in Europe, et cetera, they're also very politically motivated in a lot of the same ways that we are here. Disgusted with political leaderships there, disgusted with alt-right movements, things like this. So there's no question, I think that's part of the role, especially if you get attracted to the music of Horace and the Ark. You know something, you learn something fast about the political history, about the political commitments. People who read, his autobiography, or if they have a chance to see The Dark Tree, it's the same kind of thing. They're drawn to this this notion of the arts as a force within the movement for political change. I think that's very important. I don't see as much of it, though. I mean, we can't, it still pales in comparison to back in the day when there was so much going on and so many people in the streets and active, et cetera. You can't expect the same kind of energy. And I know some of the older guys in the ARC, one especially who came from Europe not too long ago, and while he was out here, was playing in the ARC again. And we were talking, and he was talking about saying how, yeah, it's great to have these young people coming around, great young musicians who were flocking around now, which hadn't been the case in a while, you know, et cetera. But he felt that, you know, the feeling in the band was they're just going from gig to gig, you know, and they're not taking the music to the community, doing whatever they have to do to get it out there, playing in schools, playing in prisons, playing in parks. Part of that isn't just their choosing, though. We also are living in a time where public space is not what it used to be.
Absolutely.
Which just makes it so very hard. One of the worst times for the orchestra was that period of the early 80s, when all of a sudden public space, which was their home, their base, that's how they brought art to the community, just completely shrunk. And they lost so much. It was public space, it was public support for arts within the schools, et cetera. It was just devastating. I mean, where even front yards, you know, weren't free spaces anymore. So I think that's had a huge impact as well in constricting people's visions. And that's, I think, one of the big issues that they're wrestling with now. The other thing too was that I hadn't mentioned, but you know, for the first 20 years of the organization, they lived in communal houses, or the younger ones in the movement did. And it was, quote unquote, easier to do that. You could rent a house without that much money, in which you could have, you know, 18 musicians living and consequently playing music all the time, giving performances there and going out, et cetera, et cetera. You know, it's not so possible anymore. So there are a lot of constraints, but they're still at it. They're still playing hard. And I'm convinced that when the wheel does turn and things open up again, they'll be right there. And it'll come out in the music.
And they're doing it different ways too.
Yeah.
There's been change.
Yeah, a lot. Well, that's one of the interesting things. If you have a chance to watch this documentary on the New West Coast Sound, you can see ways in which the music is evolving as well.
I know also Mark Bradford has made some investments in the community in Leimert Park.
Very important. Mark Bradford's the visual artist I mentioned earlier, who, you know,
yes, that's why I mentioned it.
Yeah, he's probably the most important visual artist in the world now, bar none. And what he did, I think it was about 10 years ago, he, along with his partner, Alan DeCastro, and Eileen Norton, Peter Norton's ex, they created Art and Practice, which is a foundation to support the arts. And what they did, well, what they've done is essentially buy up about half those properties in Leimert Park. The series of storefronts that were the Brockman Gallery back in the day, they own all of those. And they own properties on the other side as well. They also have a gallery now at the west corner of Degnan and 43rd Place. They own a lot of property. And their ambition, I don't know if it still is, but when they started, was to create an international arts center. They have spaces and they give year fellowships to artists who work there. And they have galleries and they want to create, you know, this incredible scene. Now, I don't know where that's at now. Since the pandemic, there hasn't been a lot of movement or discussion. Maybe you know a bit more, Elaine, about that. I don't.
Well, it slowed down because of the pandemic, but Eileen's, her main focus was to make sure the community youth and others are involved and would be able to be at the center. She had a couple openings, gallery openings that the community was invited. So I'm not sure they're going at the same pace as planned, but I know that initially that was her interest.
It was, what they were doing was incredibly ambitious, but as time went on in the first couple of years, I know there were problems with people in the community. With some of the other spaces there, people had the feeling that Alan DeCastro could care less about the community. He wanted to be and move in the circles of high art, and that their interests were being ignored. A couple of plans fell through with some of the local folks. The World Stage had to move out of one of their properties across the street, which actually turned out great for the World Stage. Their space now is really quite something. And Dwight Tribble has been an amazing director. He really has advanced the stage, but it's been prickly. It hasn't been smooth. And I don't know, we'll see what happens.
I think as Mark gained international prominence, he was a bit more hands-on, but since then, and Eileen certainly, so I think that that's made a difference.
I'm sure.
Because his partner wasn't as community-based oriented.
He's in such demand everywhere. That's
yeah.
Well, Steve, I want to thank you again for your generous spirit and spending all this time with us and bringing us an important part of the history in Los Angeles and just raising all these interesting questions about the relationship between art and politics and spirituality and community, which I hope continues to resonate throughout the messy conversations that we have going forward. We also want to wish you best of luck with the second edition of Dark Tree.
Thank you.